The first sound was not the music drifting from inside the hotel ballroom. It was the harsh scrape of polished leather shoes against stone, a step too heavy for the elegance of the evening. Outside the Plaza in New York, cameras flashed, chauffeurs rushed to open doors, and guests in tailored tuxedos glided past velvet ropes. This was not just another night, it was the night a billion-dollar deal was about to be sealed, a transaction that could redraw the skyline and cement one man's reputation forever. That man was Richard Cole, CEO of Cole & Crown Holdings. To the public, he was a self-made icon, the kind of man newspapers called unstoppable. To those who worked under him, he was something else entirely. Richard exited his Bentley with the same posture he carried in every boardroom. Chin slightly raised, gaze scanning the world as if he alone owned it. But before the doorman could fully welcome him, his eyes darted to the seat behind. A single coffee stain, no larger than a coin, had spread across the cream leather interior. His expression froze. "Unbelievable," he muttered, before his voice sharpened into ice. He turned on the driver, Daniel Reyes, standing by with the restraint of someone used to waiting. "I asked for black coffee in a travel mug. Not a disaster on my seats. Do you even think before you move? One job, Daniel. One. And you still managed to screw it up." The words landed with a weight disproportionate to the mistake. Daniel kept his hands steady at his sides, but the sting reached his eyes. A few guests turned their heads. They had expected small talk about real estate or fashion, not the public humiliation of a man in uniform. Richard didn't care. He pulled a monogrammed handkerchief from his pocket, dabbing at the leather as though the sight of Daniel offended him more than the stain itself. One of the bellhops nearby looked down, trying to hide his disapproval. A woman passing with her husband gave Daniel a sympathetic glance. The injustice was palpable, hanging in the cold winter air like smoke. Here was a man in a perfectly pressed suit reducing another to nothing with just a few sharp words, as if power and respect were privileges reserved only for those seated at the table inside. Richard tossed the handkerchief back at Daniel, not directly into his hands, but onto the ground near his shoes. "Clean it up. Quietly. And don't let me see your face when I walk back out." Drivers are supposed to stay invisible. Then, with a practiced smile, he turned toward the cameras waiting by the entrance. The flashbulbs captured only the charming grin, not the dismissal that had cut like glass seconds earlier. That is how toxic leadership hides in plain sight, smiles for the crowd, cruelty for the unseen. Inside, whispers had already started. A junior investor who caught the moment on his phone slid it back into his pocket, debating whether to share it. A young woman working coat check shook her head slowly. She had seen CEOs come and go, but rarely had she seen contempt so raw, so unnecessary. Daniel bent down, picked up the handkerchief, and wiped the leather quietly. He had done this routine before, not the coffee spill, but the act of absorbing someone else's anger, as though it were part of his job description. The hardest part was not the cloth against the seat, but the way Richard's words erased him, as if his existence was limited to steering wheels and open doors, not thoughts, not dignity. A group of guests walked past. One man, a banker with silver hair, nodded politely to Richard, who ignored Daniel completely as though he weren't there. This was the injustice that cut deeper than the insult, not just being called incompetent, but being treated like air. The absence of acknowledgement was louder than shouting. It was the reminder that in Richard Cole's world, certain people did not count. And if you've ever been overlooked in a room, spoken over in a meeting, or made to feel as though your presence was nothing more than background noise, you know the weight Daniel carried in that moment. That's why stories like this matter. And maybe as you listen, you'll find yourself wanting to add your own thoughts, because sometimes leaving a comment is not about algorithms. It's about saying, "I've felt that too." Richard adjusted his cufflinks, as if nothing had happened. His mind was already rehearsing numbers and phrases he would deliver inside. He was about to meet William Harrington, the man whose signature could unlock the billion-dollar deal he had chased for years. To Richard, Daniel was not a person. He was scenery like the polished floor or the brass door handle, useful until he faltered, disposable once he did. But Daniel did not disappear. He stood quietly, absorbing every glance, every dismissive gesture. In his chest, there was the familiar push and pull, the urge to defend himself against humiliation, and the discipline to remain composed. He had been here before, in different forms, under different bosses. Each time the world told him, "Stay silent, stay small." But silence does not erase memory. When Richard strode into the lobby, Daniel followed at a distance. Drivers were meant to remain unseen, but he still had responsibilities, handling keys, ensuring the car was ready when called. Staff members in red uniforms passed him without eye contact. Guests in designer coats brushed by as though he were part of the wall. Even inside the glittering hotel, the same sense of invisibility pressed down. Richard thrived in these spaces. He liked that everyone looked at him, hung on his words, treated him as the center of gravity. He would never admit it, but moments like humiliating Daniel gave him an extra surge of confidence. Control was his currency, dominance, his comfort. And tonight he was determined to project both. In the lounge, soft jazz played while waiters carried champagne on silver trays. Richard adjusted his tie and allowed himself a smirk. He believed no one would remember a spilled coffee or a sharp remark. To him, the world's memory was short, attention cheaper than stock options. He had lived by that rule for decades. Strike hard, move on, never look back. What he didn't realize was that in a room filled with eyes and phones, memory had grown longer than he ever imagined. And one casual act of contempt could travel further than any press release. Daniel lingered near the service corridor, not intruding, but not gone either. His posture calm, his breathing steady, he kept himself composed. Yet beneath that calm was the ache of erasure, the kind that gnaws at a man's chest more deeply than anger. He thought of his mother telling him once, "People reveal themselves in small moments. Watch closely, and you'll know who they truly are." This was one of those moments. It is often said that business ethics are tested not when things are going well, but in the seconds when someone thinks no one important is watching. Richard had just failed that test spectacularly. And the irony was that more people had been watching than he realized. For the guests gathering in the ballroom, the evening promised luxury and opportunity. For Daniel, it was another night of standing in the margins. But margins have power. From the edges, you see the full picture. And sometimes, those edges sharpen into the turning point of an entire story. And as you continue listening, think about this. If you've ever been in Daniel's position doing your job, showing up, only to be cut down by someone who believes their title makes them more human than you, then maybe you know the bitterness he swallowed that night. If you do, I'd love to hear it. Sharing in the comments is not about telling a story into the void. It's about reminding each other we're not alone in facing the same quiet cruelty. Richard Cole entered the ballroom to applause from a few eager investors. He smiled broadly, shaking hands, his voice louder than necessary as he boasted about upcoming projects. None of them knew, or pretended not to know, about the scene outside. But Daniel knew. The bellhop knew. The couple walking in knew. And memory has a way of waiting for the right time to resurface. The music swelled, glasses clinked, and under the chandeliers, Richard felt untouchable. But shadows of arrogance always stretch further than the man casting them. Richard held court at the center of the ballroom. Every word he spoke, every confident chuckle, was calculated to reinforce the image of the man who could make or break cities. He boasted about towers piercing the skyline, about contracts locked in, about his personal touch in every decision. The crowd nodded politely, even when they did not care. This was how power maintained itself in rooms like this, through repetition, through performance. But just a few steps away, Daniel blended into the background. Not because he lacked presence, but because the structure of the room told him to. People in uniform were supposed to fade. They were supposed to refill glasses, carry coats, open doors, all without leaving an impression. Yet the sting from earlier lingered on his skin. He could still hear the words, "stupid driver." He could still feel the dismissal, as though his existence carried less weight than the liquid on the seat. Richard did not glance back at him once. Why would he? In Richard's eyes, Daniel had no more relevance than a revolving door. That was the cruelty at its sharpest. Not just the insult, but the deliberate erasure. And erasure eats at the spirit differently than anger. Anger burns hot, then fades. Erasure stays. For Daniel, it was not the first time. Too many jobs, too many men with titles larger than their humility. Yet each repetition carved deeper. And while Richard sipped champagne and laughed at his own jokes, Daniel reminded himself, "Stay steady." His mother's words echoed again. People show you who they are, in the way they treat those they don't need. Richard moved toward the head table, shaking the hands of executives, his smile practiced, his grip firm. He carried himself as though the CEO scandal that had just unfolded outside was too small to matter. That was his habit. Problems were either buried or bullied into silence. He believed he was immune to consequences. After all, hadn't he risen through decades of boardroom battles by outshouting everyone else? Hadn't he built an empire on fear and calculation? To Richard, one insult was nothing more than background noise. But background noise has a way of turning into headlines. As the speeches began, Daniel stood against the wall near the service entrance. He had no seat, no table. From there, he could see everything. He watched investors leaning forward, eager to absorb Richard's promises. He saw waiters moving gracefully, silent as shadows. He saw how Richard commanded the room with a voice that carried certainty, even when it hid contempt. Inside Daniel, two truths collided. One was exhaustion, the ache of being seen as less, of standing always on the edge of recognition. The other was determination, the resolve to endure, to remember, to let the arrogance of others expose itself without him having to say a word. It is not easy to hold both at once. That tension is heavy, but it was the weight he carried every day. Outside the ballroom, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm horns, footsteps, neon flashing against glass. Inside, a quieter but sharper rhythm took shape. Power on display, respect withheld, dignity quietly tested. This was more than a dinner. It was the stage where reputations could be made or destroyed. And Richard Cole, for all his confidence, had already set in motion a destruction he could not yet see. Because in a world where cameras sit quietly in every hand, where stories spread faster than contracts can be signed, no insult is truly private anymore. Every smirk, every word laced with contempt, carries further than the man speaking them intends. Richard believed he had crushed Daniel into invisibility. In truth, he had written the first line of his own downfall, and the eyes around him, some cold, some curious, some quietly disapproving, would not forget. Dinner progressed in carefully timed courses. Silver covers lifted in unison, waiters gliding like clockwork. Richard relished the attention. He leaned back in his chair, speaking loudly enough for neighboring tables to hear his remarks about markets, cities, and his unmatched vision. For him, this was not just a meal. It was a theater of dominance. He wanted the investors to see certainty, to feel that aligning with him was inevitable. What he did not notice was how some eyes drifted not in admiration, but in quiet calculation. A few had seen his treatment of Daniel earlier. They carried that image with them, even if they said nothing. People often remain silent in the moment, But silence is not absence. It is memory. Waiting, Daniel entered occasionally, assisting where needed. A refill of water, a steadying hand with a coat, a quiet, "Excuse me." Each time, Richard's eyes passed over him as though he were empty space. That deliberate refusal to acknowledge was sharper than an insult. It declared to everyone present, "This man is beneath me." That is how toxic leadership operates, not just by raising voices, but by cutting people out of the frame entirely. For Daniel, every step was a test of composure. He had practiced this discipline for years. Keep your tone level, keep your face calm, absorb the sting without giving the satisfaction of reaction. But inside, the pressure built. Not anger alone, something heavier. The fatigue of carrying invisibility. The weight of knowing you could be standing in a crowded room and still feel erased. Across the table, a younger investor shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Daniel with recognition. He had started his own career as a hotel porter before making it big in finance. He knew exactly what it felt like to be brushed aside. He caught Daniel's eye briefly, offering a subtle nod, a gesture that said, "I see you," even if he doesn't. It wasn't much, but it mattered. Richard, oblivious, continued his performance. He made jokes at the expense of absent rivals, bragged about projects not yet finished, spoke about how his company defined the city skyline. He believed his voice filled the room, but if one listened closely, beneath the clinking of cutlery and the faint strains of jazz, there was another sound. The quiet unease of people who recognized arrogance when they saw it. Daniel stepped back into the corridor for a moment, taking in a long breath. He was used to playing the invisible man, but nights like this pressed harder. He thought about how often society tells men in his position, "Endure, take it, keep moving." He thought about the countless others whose stories never get told because their humiliation was written off as unimportant. That's why stories like this need to be told in the first place. They are not about gossip or spectacle. They are about truth, and if hearing this brings back a memory of your own something you carried quietly, something that never got acknowledged, you might want to share it. Not for me, not for numbers, but because adding your voice in the comments can remind someone else that their dignity mattered too. Back in the ballroom, the spotlight remained fixed on Richard. He thrived under it, convinced that the night belonged to him. But power is not proven by the volume of your voice. It is revealed in how you treat the people with the least leverage in the room. Richard failed that measure the moment he dismissed Daniel. And failure at that level does not stay hidden for long. The investors laughed at his jokes, but their eyes betrayed something else: calculation, skepticism, a faint hesitation. They had seen leaders rise and fall before. They knew money follows character as much as contracts. And what they had glimpsed tonight was not character but contempt. Daniel returned one final time to collect empty glasses. Richard didn't look at him, not even when Daniel stood within arm's reach. To Richard, he was still a shadow, yet to everyone else watching, the contrast was impossible to miss. The man demanding respect gave none. The man treated as invisible carried himself with quiet steadiness. And that is how the foundation of a reputation begins to crack, not with numbers, not with strategy, but with the refusal to offer basic respect. The chandeliers glowed brighter as the evening advanced, music swelling to cover the murmurs. Richard raised his glass in a toast, declaring that tonight marked the dawn of a new empire. Applause followed, but not all of it was sincere. Because while Richard believed he had erased a man, what he had actually done was write a story that would not stay buried. And as Daniel stepped back into the corner, steady as ever, the air shifted almost imperceptibly. Somewhere between the laughter and the clinking glasses, respect had already begun to move away from the man at the head table. The applause was still fading when Richard lowered his glass, his eyes scanning the room for signs of weakness. He always searched for it: nervous glances, subtle frowns, any sign he could exploit. It was instinct now, a habit sharpened over decades. To him, people were not people. They were leverage points, variables in a formula. If they hesitated, he owned them. If they flinched, he consumed them. If they resisted, he erased them. At 45, Richard Cole wore the image of triumph like a second skin. His suit was custom, his watch rare, his posture one of practiced authority. To the world, he was the CEO who turned neglected lots into skyscrapers, who built a fortune brick by brick. But beneath the polished surface lay a man carved from contempt. He did not believe in collaboration, only conquest. To him, business was not about growth. It was war, and wars needed casualties. He had built Cole and Crown Holdings with that philosophy. Inside his offices, hesitation was punished, loyalty demanded without question. Employees called him the scalpel clean, precise, and merciless. He had fired men and women mid-meeting, erased careers with a single email, and replaced colleagues of years with strangers overnight. He believed this made him efficient. Ruthless efficiency was his creed. Fear was his shield. Yet fear leaves a residue. It lingers in the hallways of corporations, in whispers around lunch tables, in the way eyes avoid contact when footsteps approach. Those who worked for Richard survived by silence. They endured, calculated, and prayed they wouldn't be next. This was the toxic leadership that defined his empire. Investors admired the returns. Employees carried the scars. And while Richard soaked in the glow of admiration tonight, Daniel lingered again in the margins. Tray balanced carefully, expression neutral, he remained the invisible presence Richard demanded him to be. But Daniel's invisibility was never complete. His silence carried weight. His composure, a quiet resistance. Every insult Richard had delivered, every glance of dismissal, every deliberate erasure, Daniel absorbed them all, but not without memory. Richard never wondered what lived behind Daniel's eyes. Why should he? In his mind, drivers were replaceable. Staff came and went. The city was full of men in uniforms willing to take orders. He did not care that Daniel's jaw tightened slightly when addressed like a child. He did not care that Daniel's eyes had depth, carrying a quiet strength that did not bend. Richard only cared that the car was on time, the coffee delivered, the door held open. Nothing more. And yet, even in his arrogance, Richard understood one thing. He needed this night to go flawlessly. The billion-dollar deal with William Harrington was not just money. It was legacy. Harrington was a legend, an investor whose choices shaped industries. If Richard closed this acquisition, his name would be etched into the city's history alongside Harrington's. And Richard craved that kind of permanence. Not just wealth, but immortality. Through recognition, the weight of that desire drove him to perfectionism. He had rehearsed his talking points, memorized market projections, choreographed the timing of every course. He even ordered the music selections, believing the right tempo could soften negotiations. Control was his obsession. He believed control separated leaders from the led, but he mistook control for character. And tonight, that mistake would matter more than anything he could predict. Daniel adjusted his stance near the far wall. From here, he could see Richard's entire performance. The grand smile, the firm handshake, the booming laugh designed to dominate the room. He had seen it many times before, different suits, different rooms, same act. Each time it reinforced the same message. Richard believed dignity was a currency he alone could spend or deny. Daniel thought briefly of his own life outside these walls. A small apartment uptown, modest furniture, shelves filled with second-hand books. His mother's photograph rested by the window, her eyes still kind even in faded print. She had raised him with the belief that respect was not optional, that every human deserved acknowledgement. Watching Richard trample that belief so casually tonight reminded him why those lessons mattered. A burst of laughter erupted from the head table. Richard had made another cutting joke. This time, at the expense of a rival developer. The investors joined in, some genuinely amused, others merely following the script of power. Laughter in such rooms often hides discomfort, masking the recognition of cruelty with the safety of conformity. Daniel caught sight of one man who didn't laugh. A mid-level partner, maybe in his 30s, with cautious eyes. He looked at Richard, then at Daniel, then back again. His lips tightened slightly, as if he had tasted something bitter. It was small, almost imperceptible. But Daniel noticed. Sometimes the smallest reactions reveal the deepest truths. Richard leaned forward, lowering his voice as he spoke about profits, expansions, and returns. Gentlemen, what I offer is not just investment, it's inevitability. Cole and Crown doesn't ask for belief. We demand results. Align with me, and the skyline belongs to us. His words were crisp, each syllable deliberate. He had delivered lines like this countless times, convinced that certainty itself was a weapon. But certainty is fragile when built on arrogance. As the evening continued, Daniel moved quietly through the room. Each step reinforced the hierarchy. Richard at the center, Daniel on the edge. Yet edges are not empty. They are where the unseen gathers, where stories begin to shift. Daniel felt the stares of a few who had noticed the earlier exchange outside. They didn't speak, but their eyes carried silent judgment. Richard, wrapped in his own performance, remained blind to it. For a man obsessed with control, he failed to control the most basic measure, how he treated the person standing closest to him every day. And that failure hung in the air like static, unnoticed only by him. Daniel steadied his tray, inhaled, exhaled. This was not the first night he had endured disrespect, but it was the first time it carried this weight, in this room, before this deal. Something about the combination, the grandeur of the setting, the presence of Harrington, the sheer arrogance of Richard's words, made the injustice sharper. If you've ever stood in a place where your effort went unseen, where your presence was acknowledged only in mistakes, then you understand the heaviness pressing on Daniel's chest. And perhaps hearing this stirs something in you too. That's the moment when subscribing isn't about following a channel. It's about staying connected to stories that remind us dignity matters, even when power says it doesn't. Richard raised his voice again, drawing the room back to him. He thrived on the illusion that attention equaled respect. But respect cannot be forced. It is earned, moment by moment, in how we treat those with nothing to offer us in return. He had forgotten that truth. Or perhaps he had never learned it. The music played on, plates cleared, glasses refilled. From the outside, the evening looked flawless. But beneath the surface, the cracks were already forming. And cracks, once visible, only widen. The chandeliers shimmered brighter as servers carried in the next course, crystal glasses catching the light like small stars. Conversations softened, replaced by the rhythm of forks against porcelain. Richard leaned back in his chair, confident that the room was his to command. Every gesture, every pause in his speech was designed to project control. He believed control was the same as respect. He was wrong. William Harrington sat across the table, a man whose reputation needed no introduction. At 70, his posture was still erect, his eyes steady, his demeanor calm. He was known for listening more than he spoke. Investors feared his silence more than they feared the harshest critiques from others. A nod from Harrington could raise valuations overnight. A frown could sink reputations. Tonight, his attention was priceless. Richard told himself he already had it, but Harrington's eyes lingered not only on Richard. They drifted across the room, to the staff, to the quiet details most ignored. He noticed the way Daniel set down glasses with steady precision. He noticed the way Richard never once acknowledged him. Observers like Harrington did not miss small things. They built empires on them. Richard leaned forward, his voice low but carrying enough for nearby tables to overhear. "Mr. Harrington, this is not just an opportunity. This is inevitability. Cole and Crown Holdings is not chasing markets, we are creating them. What we're offering is a guaranteed return. In under 18 months, your investment doubles. This is how billion-dollar deals are made." Harrington did not reply immediately. He sipped his water, eyes calm, face unreadable. Richard mistook the silence for interest. He mistook stillness for weakness. At that same moment, Daniel approached with a bottle of wine. His steps were measured, his movements careful. He reached across to pour into Richard's glass. Just as the crimson liquid touched the rim, Richard's hand shifted abruptly, knocking the edge of the glass. A splash of red stained the immaculate white tablecloth. A few drops struck the cuff of Richard's suit. The room stilled. Forks hovered, conversations broke mid-sentence. Even the quartet hesitated on their instruments. Richard's jaw tightened. He did not see an accident. He saw an offense. His eyes snapped to Daniel, with a glare that carried the weight of years of unchecked authority. "Do you have any idea what this jacket costs?" His voice was low, sharp, cutting through the silence. "Of course you don't. You don't understand value. You understand nothing. Stupid driver." The insult landed heavier this time, amplified by the room's stillness. Guests froze, some glancing down, others watching with widened eyes. Phones shifted subtly upward, screens glowing in laps and hands. Not everyone recorded, but enough did. Enough to turn a moment into memory, and memory into evidence. Daniel's hand held steady around the bottle. He did not flinch. He did not answer. His breathing slowed. His gaze lowered just slightly, not out of weakness, but out of discipline. He would not let Richard dictate his reaction. The weight of injustice pressed on him, but he carried it in silence. Richard dabbed at his cuff again, muttering something about incompetence. A junior executive at his side laughed awkwardly, hoping to ease the tension. The laugh only deepened the discomfort. Around the table, faces betrayed unease. Harrington, however, remained utterly still. His fork rested against his plate, untouched. His eyes, calm but heavy, locked on Richard. Daniel stepped back slowly, setting the bottle on the side table. He whispered only one line, voice even, tone unbroken. "Please enjoy your meal, sir." Then he withdrew to the wall, posture straight, expression steady. The silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Conversations tried to restart, but the rhythm faltered. People spoke, but their words lacked life. Phones vibrated discreetly. The damage was done. But not to Daniel. It was Richard who had just fractured his own image. Harrington turned slightly to his assistant, murmuring something in a language most at the table didn't recognize. The assistant nodded, stood, and slipped quietly toward the back. Richard, oblivious, continued his pitch, raising his voice, trying to recapture the energy. He believed words could bury actions. He did not understand that character, once revealed, cannot be undone by volume. Daniel stood against the wall again, tray balanced on his hand. His heart beat steady. He had heard worse before. He had endured quieter humiliations in smaller rooms. But this was different, not because of the insult itself, but because it had been witnessed. Because others had seen. Because silence no longer meant invisibility. The next course arrived, roasted duck plated with precision. Daniel stepped forward again, moving carefully between guests. He placed the plate before Harrington first, then before his assistants, then the other investors, and Richard last. It was a small detail, but details matter, Richard noticed. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing. He muttered under his breath, "Still learning your place, I see." Daniel didn't respond. He served with the same calm precision, his face unchanged. But the room noticed. Harrington noticed. The investors noticed. Even the waitstaff along the walls noticed. It was not defiance. It was dignity. And dignity carries power. Even when spoken in silence, Richard raised his voice again, attempting to push the evening forward. Gentlemen, let's talk numbers. 4.2 billion, full integration within 2 quarters. Your ROI doubles in 18 months. This is how winners operate. Winners dominate. Winners don't let distractions stop them. His words rang hollow. They filled the air with sound, but not substance. Across the table, Harrington set down his fork again. Slowly, deliberately, he looked at Daniel, then back at Richard. His eyes held the weight of judgment, unspoken but unmistakable. Daniel moved with steady composure, refilling glasses, straightening settings, always professional. Yet beneath his calm lay a storm. He thought of the countless moments in life where men like Richard believed their status gave them permission to strip dignity from others. He thought of the small humiliations endured by millions who never had a voice. Tonight, he carried them all quietly in his silence, and Harrington saw it. He saw the pause behind Daniel's eyes, the restraint in his movements, the choice to remain composed when most would have broken. He recognized it. He respected it, because character is revealed in how one rises under pressure, not in how one shines when praised. The evening pressed on, but something in the air had shifted. Investors whispered quietly to one another. Phones lit up beneath tables. The atmosphere no longer belonged to Richard. It belonged to the moment, and the moment was no longer about numbers. It was about values. The ballroom sparkled. The music resumed. The food remained exquisite. But under the glitter, the ground had shifted. Richard did not yet see it. He believed the night was still his, but those who watched knew differently. They had seen arrogance exposed. They had seen dignity endure. And the balance of power had already begun to change. The hum of conversation faltered when William Harrington finally placed his napkin on the table. The movement was small, almost unremarkable, but it drew every eye. Harrington rarely acted without purpose. He had listened quietly for hours, had watched every gesture, every word, every silence. Now, he was ready to move. Richard noticed the shift but mistook it for curiosity. He straightened in his chair, certain that his pitch had landed. He believed Harrington was about to confirm the deal, the $4.2 billion agreement that would secure his empire. A smile spread across his face, the kind of smile that had charmed boardrooms and bulldozed competitors. But Harrington didn't look at Richard. His gaze slid past him, steady, deliberate, until it rested on Daniel standing near the wall. For a brief second, the ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Daniel felt the weight of that gaze, not heavy with judgment but filled with recognition. Harrington spoke softly, his voice carrying nonetheless. "There is someone in this room who deserves to be acknowledged." Richard laughed, raising his glass. Of course. Recognition is important. The staff has been excellent tonight." He gestured vaguely toward the waiters, as though the statement were generous. Harrington didn't blink. His expression remained composed. He raised a hand slightly, and from the far wall, Daniel stepped forward. His movements were calm, steady, every step deliberate. The room watched as the man they had ignored all evening now crossed into the light of the head table. Richard frowned, confused. "What is this?" he asked. His voice edged with irritation. Harrington rested his hand lightly on Daniel's shoulder. "This," he said evenly, "is Daniel Reyes, my son." The words cracked through the ballroom like glass under pressure. Gasps escaped, forks clattered, a phone slipped from someone's hand. Richard blinked rapidly, as if the statement were impossible to process. His mind searched for denial, for some explanation, but the truth was undeniable. Daniel did not lower his head now. He stood tall, shoulders square, eyes steady. The man who had been dismissed as invisible, insulted as incompetent, now stood beside one of the most powerful investors in the country. Harrington continued, his voice calm, but carrying a sharp edge. Daniel chose to work here not because he needed income, but because he wanted to see for himself how men in positions of power treat those they believe are beneath them. He looked directly at Richard. Tonight, you all witnessed exactly that. Silence gripped the room. No one moved, no one spoke. Phones tilted higher, capturing every second. Richard's face flushed red. He forced a strained laugh. "Mr. Harrington, surely this is unnecessary. We're here to discuss business, not staff arrangements." Harrington's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Business is character. And, tonight, character has been tested." The weight of his words pressed harder than any financial figure. Investors shifted in their seats, some avoiding Richard's gaze, others staring with open disapproval. They had all seen, they had all heard, and now the insult carried a price larger than Richard could have calculated. Daniel remained silent. His dignity lay not in retaliation, but in presence. He had no need to shout, no need to explain. Simply standing beside Harrington was enough to rewrite the hierarchy of the room. The man once erased was now undeniable. Richard struggled, words tumbling from his lips. This is absurd. A driver, pretending. Harrington cut him off, voice sharper now, though still composed. "He is not pretending. He is my son. And the way you treated him reveals more about your leadership than any spreadsheet could. If you cannot respect the person standing before you, you cannot be trusted to respect partners, employees, or anyone else." The murmurs rose louder, spreading across the tables. Some investors began tapping at their phones, already sending messages. A few excused themselves quietly, slipping out into the hallway. The energy of the evening had shifted entirely. The billion-dollar deal was no longer about numbers. It was about dignity, about business ethics, about whether power could survive without respect. Richard's hands clenched the stem of his wineglass until it nearly snapped. He tried to speak again, to regain control, but his voice faltered. For the first time all night, certainty had abandoned him. Daniel looked at him directly now, his voice calm. "Even, you told me I was invisible. But the truth is, everyone was watching." The sentence hung in the air, simple and devastating. Phones caught it, ears carried it, and reputations bent beneath it. Harrington nodded once. "The deal is over." He didn't raise his voice, but he didn't need to. Those 4 words echoed louder than any of Richard's boasts. A chair scraped back, followed by another. Guests began to rise, some leaving, others lingering only long enough to witness the unraveling of a man who had believed himself untouchable. Notifications buzzed as headlines began to draft themselves. CEO scandal unfolds at billion-dollar dinner. Toxic leadership exposed in public. Power and respect collide in unexpected twist. Richard sat frozen, his empire slipping through his fingers. Undone not by market forces or contracts, but by arrogance. And beside Harrington, Daniel stood tall, silent, dignified, the living reminder that respect is never optional. The room's center of gravity had shifted permanently. Richard no longer commanded it. Harrington and Daniel did. The chandeliers glowed just as brightly. The music still played, but nothing was the same. The illusion of control had shattered. The first sound was not a voice. It was the scrape of a chair sliding back from the table. Then, another. The ballroom shifted as men and women who had applauded Richard hours earlier now rose to their feet, not in respect but in retreat. Phones buzzed, screens glowed. A ripple of messages moved faster than the waitstaff could clear plates. Richard sat rigid, gripping the arms of his chair. His face burned, his breath uneven. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words tangled, strangled by the silence pressing in from every side. The deal was gone. He knew it. Everyone knew it. 4 words from Harrington had erased months of preparation, erased decades of intimidation, erased the illusion of inevitability. But the collapse didn't stop at the table. It spread outward, like cracks in glass racing to the edge. Within minutes, whispers turned into calls. Investors stepped into hallways, their voices urgent, instructing assistants to reevaluate positions, to protect portfolios, to distance themselves from Cole and Crown Holdings. Notifications spilled across news feeds. Harrington withdraws from $4.2 billion rupees deal. CEO scandal erupts in New York. The quartet in the corner struggled to continue their melody, but even music could not hide the truth. The room had shifted beyond recovery. Richard forced himself to stand. His voice, usually booming, trembled under the weight of eyes fixed on him. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not be rash. Deals are complex. Negotiations take turns. What happened here tonight? He gestured vaguely toward Daniel, dismissively. Shouldn't overshadow the bigger picture. No one clapped. No one nodded. The silence swallowed him whole. At another table, an investor shook his head, murmuring to his colleague, "Numbers don't matter if the man can't command respect." The words carried, soft but sharp, slicing through Richard's last defense. Daniel stood near Harrington, silent. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. His posture remained steady, his presence dignified. He had no need to celebrate. The truth was enough. His silence was louder than Richard's flailing words. The evening bled into night, and the dominoes fell faster. Within an hour, financial news outlets confirmed the collapse of the deal. Headlines piled up. Toxic leadership costs CEO billions. Harrington rejects arrogance at dinner. Power shifts after scandal. By the time dessert plates touched linen, Richard's empire had already begun to unravel. Calls flooded his phone. Board members demanding answers, lawyers warning of liability, PR advisors urging immediate statements. His screen lit up with names he could not ignore. Each vibration was another reminder that his grip was slipping. He excused himself from the table, stepping into a corridor lined with mirrors. His reflection stared back, pale, sweating, the smile gone. He pressed his phone to his ear. "We need to get ahead of this. Draft a release. No, don't mention his son. Keep it professional. Focus on the deal structure. Spin it." The voice on the other end hesitated. "Richard, it's already viral. Clips are everywhere. It's not about numbers anymore. It's about you." The word landed heavy. You. Not the company. Not the market. Him. The man who had believed he was untouchable was now the liability. Back in the ballroom, Harrington remained composed. He spoke quietly with investors, his voice calm, his presence steady. Daniel stood nearby, answering softly when addressed, still carrying himself with the same dignity he had shown all evening. To those watching, the contrast was undeniable. One man unraveling in desperation, another standing silent yet unbroken. By midnight, the markets had reacted. Cole and Crown stock plummeted. 22% gone before Richard had even left the hotel. Analysts dissected the scandal live on air. Words like arrogance, CEO scandal, toxic leadership flashed across screens. Richard's name trended alongside hashtags, demanding accountability. In his penthouse hours later, Richard paced alone. The city lights blinked below, indifferent. His phone vibrated relentlessly. Board members wanted a meeting at dawn. His general counsel warned of lawsuits. A major sponsor had already cut ties. Contracts evaporated before his eyes. He poured himself a drink, hands shaking. The glass rattled against the counter. For the first time in years, fear crept in, not of competition, not of markets, but of irrelevance. He had built his empire on control, yet now control had slipped entirely from his grasp. Meanwhile, Daniel returned quietly to his apartment. He hung his jacket, set down his keys, and sat in silence. The night had been heavy, but he carried no triumph, only clarity. He thought of his mother's words. Respect is the simplest test of a man. Some pass quietly, some fail loudly. Tonight, Richard had failed for the world to see, and yet Daniel felt no joy in it. Humiliation, even when deserved, leaves a bitter taste. What mattered was not Richard's fall, but the reminder that dignity endures, that power without respect collapses always. In the early hours of the morning, Cole and Crown Holdings released a statement attempting to frame the evening as a misunderstanding exaggerated by social media. The markets did not believe it. By sunrise, the company's stock had dropped further, sponsors withdrawn, clients reconsidering. The empire was not just shaken, it was crumbling. At 11:47 p.m., the board voted to suspend Richard as CEO. By dawn, his access to company accounts had been revoked. He was no longer in control. The man who had dismissed another as invisible was now the one erased, but the dominoes did not stop with him. His executives faced scrutiny. His projects stalled. His reputation turned from asset to liability. Toxic leadership had consequences, and this time the world had watched it play out in real time. In every office the next day, employees whispered about the scandal. Some felt vindicated. Others felt relief. Many had endured Richard's contempt for years. Now they watched as his downfall became a case study in arrogance. They spoke of the videos, the silence, the way Daniel had stood calm under pressure. They shared clips not just as gossip, but as proof. Dignity is stronger than dominance. And across the city, people who had never heard of Cole and Crown before now repeated the story. Not about buildings or profits, but about a CEO who lost everything because he failed the most basic test of character. The city was still waking when Daniel walked through the glass doors of Harrington Holdings. The building rose quietly against the skyline, less flashy than the towers Richard Cole had built, but steadier, more grounded. Inside, employees moved with calm purpose. There was no panic, no chaos, only the rhythm of a place where respect was woven into the culture. Daniel wore no uniform this morning. No driver's cap, no plain jacket. Instead, a tailored blazer, fit neatly on his shoulders, not ostentatious, but professional. His steps echoed across marble floors as security greeted him by name. For the first time in years, he felt the subtle shift of being seen, not as background, but as someone who mattered. On the top floor, a nameplate waited outside an office. Daniel Reyes, Director of Ethical Leadership. The title was new, created at William Harrington's insistence. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't decorative. It carried decision-making authority, with the task of ensuring that dignity and accountability would never again be optional in the companies Harrington backed. Daniel paused at the doorway before entering. He thought of the night before the sting of insult, the heavy silence, the sudden shift when truth emerged. He thought of the years of invisibility, the countless times he had been brushed aside. This office did not erase those experiences, but it gave them meaning. It proved they had been seen. He sat at his desk, exhaled slowly, and let the moment settle. The phone on his desk blinked with incoming calls, messages from colleagues welcoming him, reporters asking for statements, leaders from other firms reaching out. But for now, he allowed himself quiet. Later that afternoon, he stepped onto a stage prepared for a company-wide address. Screens connected employees from New York to London, from San Francisco to Singapore. Many had only seen Daniel through the viral clips circulating online. Now they waited to hear his voice directly. He spoke evenly, without theatrics. Yesterday, I was called stupid. Not because of a mistake I made, but because someone believed their title made them more human than me. In that moment, I said nothing. But today, I choose to speak. The room, both physical and virtual, fell silent. There is a difference between power and leadership. Power can be taken. Leadership is earned. I didn't take this position. I was trusted with it. And I intend to honor that trust. His tone was calm, but it carried weight. He did not lecture. He simply told the truth. I believe every role deserves dignity. I believe leadership without respect is not leadership at all. I believe companies must be measured not just by what they produce, but by how they treat the people who produce it. That is what I stand for. That is what this office will stand for. Applause erupted, not polite, not forced, but genuine. Employees leaned closer to their screens. They saw in Daniel not just a new director, but a reminder of their own worth. For some, it was the first time they felt their quiet struggles had been acknowledged at the highest level. Outside the company, the story spread further. News anchors repeated clips of his speech, highlighting words like dignity, accountability, respect. Editorials framed it as a turning point in corporate culture. The scandal of Richard Cole had already saturated headlines, but Daniel's rise shifted the narrative. It was no longer only about collapse. It was about renewal. Meanwhile, Richard sat isolated in his penthouse, stripped of his title, his access, his illusion of control. The city he once claimed to own moved on without him. His empire, built on fear, had crumbled in days. The man who had reduced another to invisibility was now invisible himself. Daniel, however, carried forward, not revenge, but purpose. He knew the temptation of bitterness, but he refused it. His focus was on the millions who had endured similar moments of dismissal, who had been made to feel invisible in their own workplaces. He wanted his position to mean something for them. In the weeks that followed, he began meeting with employees, listening to their stories. A janitor in London shared how he had worked 20 years without acknowledgement. A receptionist in New York spoke of being talked over in meetings. A young engineer in Singapore described being dismissed by managers for her accent. Daniel listened to each of them, not as a formality, but as a promise. He kept a simple journal on his desk, not filled with contracts or numbers, but with names, dates, and stories. He called it the Ledger of Respect. His goal was clear. No one in a Harrington-backed company would ever again be treated as invisible. The world outside continued to buzz about the scandal, the downfall, the billions lost. But Daniel rarely mentioned Richard Cole. The story wasn't about one man's arrogance. It was about the choice each of us faces daily. How do we treat the people we think can't affect us? How do we act when no one important seems to be watching? Because someone is always watching. Sometimes it's a colleague. Sometimes it's a stranger. Sometimes it's the future itself, recording silently, waiting to remind us of who we really are. Daniel ended his first address with words that would be quoted for weeks. Respect is not extra credit. It's the baseline. And starting today, we are building on that baseline together. The applause that followed was real. Employees wiped tears. Executives nodded with conviction. And for once, a corporate announcement felt less like strategy and more like truth. As he stepped down from the stage, Daniel felt the weight of the journey behind him, the insults, the silence, the invisibility. None of it had broken him. Instead, it had shaped him into someone ready to lead with clarity. Outside the building, traffic moved as usual. Pedestrians hurried across crosswalks, cabs honked, lights flickered on skyscrapers. Life went on. But within those ordinary rhythms, something had shifted. A new conversation had begun, not about profits, but about people, not about dominance, but about dignity. And somewhere in the city, perhaps in a quiet cafe or a crowded train, someone watched Daniel's story, and felt less alone. They realized that invisibility is never permanent, that respect matters, that leadership is measured not in titles, but in humanity. The story that began with arrogance ended not with revenge, but with a reminder. How we treat others is the legacy we leave behind.